The term climate justice is used to describe how the climate crisis is social, political, and economic, rather than just a physical process. Discussions of climate justice are therefore considerably better at discussing racism within a climate context and climate within a context of race. When these ideas are adapted by the climate movement here in the UK and, I imagine, other similar countries, much of this centres on how the crisis is playing out, particularly on how it disproportionately impacts on poor people of colour, Black, Indigenous, LGBTQ+, and disabled people, and those at the intersections of oppressed and marginalised identities. Activists and individuals experiencing this firsthand have been telling us for decades that those least responsible for causing the climate crisis are those who are being affected first and worst. It's a bit late, but it has been good to see the wider movement here embracing these conversations. My concern, however, is that it's not engaging with the issue of racism in full. When climate groups start talking about the cause of the crisis, they point to unrelenting capitalism as the problem, which of course it is. But capitalism does not exist without racism. This is the conversation we are still failing to have. Early on in this talk, I want to acknowledge that everything I'm speaking about, I've learned from those who have and are directly experiencing systemic racism, and those who are on the front lines of the crisis. I also acknowledge my privilege in being able to learn these things rather than experiencing them myself, and my general privilege by virtue of my whiteness, my nationality, and my class. When I came to the climate movement last year, it was after a decade of learning and being involved in activism around America's prison industrial complex, or the PIC. This refers to the industrial scale and functioning of the prison system, where the interests of the government and corporations are indistinguishable from each other. The PIC sees the police, surveillance, and imprisonment as the best ways to respond to problems that are inherently economic, social, and political, things like mental health, homelessness, and gender violence. Learning about just how extensive this system and way of functioning is, and how it manifests according to systemic racism, has informed, shaped, and inspired my activism and my actions every day. When I came to the climate space, I was drawn to the newer groups that were emerging, that I thought were demanding the system change I too so desperately wanted for the world. I find it helpful to think about the system in this way. Our economies, institutional and political practices, personal beliefs and behaviours, our policies and our culture all interact with each other to maintain a social, political and economic hierarchy where class, race, gender, sexuality, and other identities define one's position and experience. Members of the dominant group or groups enjoy privileges the oppressed and marginalised groups do not, and these same oppressed groups also experience specific disadvantages that the dominant group does not. The reason there are dominant and oppressed groups is not accidental. Dominant groups need oppressed groups to stay oppressed so they can stay dominant. The prison industrial complex in America is a living, breathing example of this, and it can also help us understand how this is replicated throughout society more widely. In America, slavery was abolished in 1865 and ratified into the American Constitution as the 13th Amendment. About a decade later, the country was deep in an economic crisis, having just lost its main and free workforce. Having possibly foreseen this, the white men in power had written a loophole into the 13th Amendment, which stated that slavery was abolished except for criminals who are considered legal slaves. They capitalised on this by creating new laws to target Black people. For example, being unemployed, the obvious reality for many previous slaves, became illegal. This meant they could be arrested, reinstated as slaves, and set to work. This amendment is still in the Constitution today. Incarcerated people in the US are still legal slaves, and companies are still using this loophole to provide free or almost free labour in their production lines. The PIC more generally is a for-profit business. Whilst only 8% of prisons in America are privately owned, 100% of prisons use private companies to provide all of their supplies: food, clothing, handcuffs, even gym equipment. Prisons need people in them to keep that profit going and growing. And whilst this is the case, those in power will continue to exploit black people and poor people of colour, along with the poorest white people in the country, to enable the prison economy. At the very heart of it all sit racism and a drive for profit. And they work in tandem. In fact, what we see is that racism produces profit. And so whilst there is money to be made, there will always be racism. If we look back in history, we see that racism actually came first. And so when we moved into capitalism, racism was seen as the key to its success. America's prison industrial complex is just one example of this in action, but every system and institution works like this in every country at every level. I'm convinced that the pandemic alone has revealed for many who had yet to truly see them the fractures, vulnerabilities, and deeply entrenched injustices of a system designed in this way. Now, with the current Black Lives Matter uprisings happening in all 50 states in America and across the globe, it's clear that even more people have come to realise this than we could ever have imagined. It seems, though, that there are still some people who have not quite engaged with this. When the pandemic hit, I saw calls from climate activists for governments and the general public not to forget that there is also a climate crisis to deal with. I'm now hearing this again with Black Lives Matter and the idea that these issues are distinct and separate. I find this truly bewildering. This is the crisis. When I talk about the climate situation as a crisis or an emergency, I'm usually referring to three things. One, the physical devastation caused by the increase in number and strength of extreme weather events like flooding and earthquakes, alongside drought that's leading to failed crops and polluted water supplies. Two, the economic and socio-economic consequences of these events. And finally, three, both the physical and the socio-economic processes that are causing these things in the first place. That is part of the crisis itself. What all these elements have in common is systemic racism and a drive for profit. Oil is a good example of this. When CEOs of oil companies want to make the most profit possible, they will choose the cheapest way to drill for it. This means they will build pipelines through land that the system considers worthless, and moreover, where those who live on it are considered disposable. This is usually on indigenous land or in communities of colour. In other words, already oppressed peoples. When this oil is then released into the atmosphere as a fossil fuel, it contributes to the increase in global warming. We know that this exponential increase in global temperatures is disrupting the careful balance of our natural world, leading to more and worse extreme weather events, which again hit the land and people with the least responsibility for causing the problem, with the least resources to respond to these events, and which are least protected in the first place. Then there's the aftermath of a disaster, where homes, businesses, possessions, and infrastructure are destroyed. The economic consequences are often insurmountable. The way the coronavirus pandemic is playing out is vastly similar. It's a physical health problem that is directly affecting millions of people around the world, and of those people, we know that the most oppressed are being disproportionately affected. In the UK, people from non-white communities are twice as likely to die from COVID-19, and in the USA, black people are up to 7 times more likely to die than white people. In both countries, the reasons are the same. Long-term systemic racism means people from these communities are more likely to be working in frontline jobs like bus drivers and health workers. They're also experiencing this virus on top of centuries of housing and healthcare inequality, which has led to them being more physically susceptible to the kinds of underlying health conditions that lead to higher rates of death with the virus. Housing inequality also means that they're more likely to live in confined conditions that make social distancing difficult or even impossible. The socio-economic impacts of a lockdown also hit those least equipped to deal with it, those already living in vulnerable circumstances and those struggling to find the resources to survive. This pandemic has not created something new. It has simply made systemic racism, inequality and injustice starker and more obvious than they already were. Though we may now be feeling quite accustomed to the changes that this pandemic has struck down upon us, just take a moment to think back to that first month, the shock and suddenness of everything, how overwhelming and terrifying things felt. part of that overwhelm was thinking about the immediate and the long-term economic and therefore social, political and personal effects of the virus. We have created a world where human well-being, public health and literal survival are so deeply intertwined with this extreme version of capitalism that when our delicate system starts to fracture, the consequences are so vast and uncontrollable that we are incapable of preventing tragedy. Though those of us who call for dismantling the system are criticised for being dramatic and idealistic, this pandemic has proven us to be the opposite. As we consider how the system we've built is devastating so many people around the world in the face of this pandemic and so many other interconnected crises, I don't think it's merely ideological thinking to call for the end of neoliberal capitalism. However, what we must also recognise and start to integrate into everything we do, particularly in the climate space, is that we are not living in a system of just capitalism, but a system of racial capitalism. A system where usually black and brown people and those from other oppressed groups must be exploited in order for others, usually white people or people in white dominant countries, to thrive. That is not a system we should ever want to live in. This pandemic has shown us how close we are to collapse and the alarming realities of the world we have created. But it has also shown us that it's possible for the system to be jolted past recognition. We must not forget that the impossible happened, and we must refuse to accept that it can't happen again. Rebecca Solnit wrote a piece at the start of lockdown that articulated the words, "I was at a loss to find myself." To paraphrase, she starts by quoting something Patricia Cullors from Black Lives Matter wrote, which states that the movement exists to provide hope and inspiration for collective action, to build collective power, to achieve collective transformation. Rooted in grief and rage, but pointed towards vision and dreams. Rebecca Solnit says this is beautiful, not only because it is hopeful, but because it acknowledges that hope can coexist with difficulty and suffering. Hope is not optimism that everything will be fine regardless. Hope offers us clarity that, amid the uncertainty ahead, there will be conflicts worth joining and the possibility of winning some of them. And one of the things most dangerous to this hope is the lapse into believing that everything was fine before disaster struck, and that all we need to do is return to things as they were. Ordinary life before the pandemic was already a catastrophe of desperation and exclusion for too many human beings, an environmental and climate catastrophe, an obscenity of inequality. It is too soon to know what will emerge from this emergency, but not too soon to start looking for chances to help decide it. Now, I don't know exactly what the future looks like, but I do have an idea of what it will take to get there. It will take more activism than we've ever seen before. It will take people who wouldn't even consider themselves activists to join in. In fact, it will take us to stop calling ourselves activists because there cannot be separation. The world is standing at the precipice of total system overhaul, and if we mobilise and organise right, we might actually be able to achieve it. The only way to do this is to recognise that it is not possible to address systemic racism, white supremacy and climate separately. They are all the same thing. We have a responsibility to learn what this really means and to call for the system that created and perpetuates it to be dismantled. It's crucial that alongside those experiencing systemic oppression, those who benefit the most from the system also resist it, reject it, and call for its abolition. This is the moment to be learning and taking action. This is the revolution.